pilot of a message that I've shared in the past. I just want to see how it works. I'm going to try and save it so it can be a YouTube MP4. I've called this very brief message Belshazzar's Feast, and the reason being that in the first couple of weeks of the COVID-19 epidemic, everything that was happening reminded me of Belshazzar's Feast. So Belshazzar was a king who'd inherited a wonderful kingdom, or from his perspective, and he owned the utensils that had been used in Solomon's temple, which his father had totally destroyed. His father had experienced madness, and at the end of his life, he turned towards the God of the Hebrews. But basically, they both had taken the Jewish people into captivity. And this story is told in Daniel chapter 5. The feast, there were 1,000 people went to that feast. And of course, there was a lot of debauchery at those kind of feasts. There was drinking, and there was a lot of boasting. And so Belshazzar brought out the gold things that had been used in the temple to show them off to his noblemen and to let them drink out of them. And so, here's a man who'd hoarded up riches for himself, who'd oppressed people, who made sure that he was well off in life, that everything was working out for him. And in the middle of the feast, a disembodied hand appeared and began to write on the wall. And you can read the full story of this, but it must have been fairly terrifying, and it frightened everyone there. But the worst thing was Belshazzar didn't know what the hand had written. It had written a message, but he couldn't recognize any of the words. So he called the magicians, and they came in, and all of their wizards and whatever else they had in the court. And none of them could make out the writing on the wall either. And then Belshazzar's wife remembered Daniel, because Daniel had come to prominence in Belshazzar's father's time. And she said, no, get this man. This man will be able to tell you what it says on the wall. And so in comes Daniel, and the king offers him all kinds of riches and gifts. And Daniel says, you can keep your gifts. He says, I'll tell you what it says on the wall. It says, you have been tried in the balance and found wanting. And he goes on to say that that very night his life will be required of him. But Belshazzar wasn't really listening, and he still put a purple robe on Daniel and thanked him for his efforts. But truly, before the night was over, Belshazzar's life was taken. And I think that we are living in a time where the writing is on the wall, that we're living in a very serious crisis. And we're in this crisis together. It's a global crisis. Nothing like this has existed before. But it's a time where all Christians are actually in the balance. We've found in the balance. We're being weighed up. How will we respond? And throughout history, Christendom, the Christian world, has actually gone forward in times of plague. History shows us that in times when the whole world is in fear and panic and behaving badly, Christians have behaved very well and have made good choices. Now, I'm not saying all Christians everywhere, but enough Christians have made good choices to gain attention for themselves and for the message. And so we are in the balance at the moment. And if we want to share justice in the world, we have to make really good choices at this time. And one of the plagues that you may have learned about at school was the Great Plague of London. And it mainly was focused on London, and it came in waves over a period of more than a decade. These plagues would kind of surge through the place. And this man, Samuel Pepys of 1665, he was a diarist, and he actually remained in London. But everyone who could possibly leave London took off. They went to the country. They got out. And he made this statement in his diary: the plague is making us cruel as dogs to one another. And so certainly people's attitudes towards the sick, towards their families, towards getting what they needed. All that came to the forefront even in 1665. And a bit later on, I'll show you what some Christians did. There was another great plague in the time of Marcus Aurelius, and these were called the Antonine Plague, and once again it was more than one plague. And Marcus Aurelius had actually gone through the ancient Near East, a bit like Nebuchadnezzar, father of Belshazzar, destroying nations, destroying people, plundering and taking whatever he wanted. But his life began to change fairly dramatically once he became emperor. He saw his own armies wiped out by plague. And during his lifetime, although he hadn't personally been responsible for oppressing and persecuting the Christians, he didn't oppose it. But he was doing a lot of thinking. And he said this, he said, "The pestilence around us is less deadly than falsehood, evil behaviour, and lack of true understanding." So I think he was a Stoic, and he was a person who was using his mind to think about having sympathy for other human beings. During those plagues, the Christians who had been relentlessly persecuted in the Roman Empire, instead of sort of running away while they could, they actually remained. They remained with their churches, with their people, and they began to minister to other people and care for other people. And a lot of the care that led to the establishment of hospitals began around about this time. The concept of caring for the sick was really unknown in the Roman and the Greek Empire. They had their own gods, and the thing about their gods is their gods didn't have any kind of ethical framework, didn't have any real philosophy of what people should do in a time of plague. And so the Christians did have a very strong understanding of what they should be doing, and they knew it was to serve God by serving humankind. Which brings us to Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, and the Cyprian Plague. And once again, not one plague, but these plagues coming in waves, and whole armies, whole towns being wiped out, and some very interesting ancient artwork that you can see relating to these plagues. And this is what Cyprian wrote: "What sublimity to stand erect amid the desolation of the human race, and not to lie prostrate with those who have no hope in God, but rather to rejoice." And so Cyprian, he preached to his people, and he told them to remain and to trust God. And he personally hadn't always done that. There had been a time of persecution where he ran away, and he bitterly regretted that, and he was ultimately martyred. But in the meantime, by preaching to his people, they went out and they began to care for the sick. They had some protection from God, and the whole concept of the hospital continued to grow, and the idea of ministering to the sick grew from that point onwards. Which brings us to this village, this remote village in England. And this remote village in England, this is a picture that was painted at the time. The plague arrived in this village. It didn't usually arrive. This was the Great Plague of London that arrived in this village in Derbyshire. And these plagues didn't usually arrive in the countryside. But someone had brought a bolt of fabric, and we're told that it contained fleas. Now, I don't know if that's just there was a book written which used this particular event, but it certainly wasn't the truth. It was a novel, and at the end, the author had the people turning from prayer and going into witchcraft, which I suppose suits 21st century audiences. But that's not what happened. What happened was that the pastor of these people, and they were Puritans, you can tell by their tall hats, and their bonnets, they were Puritans. And they were people who understood the word of God, who'd heard it preached, and believed that God would speak. And God had spoken to their leader, and he had spoken to the Church of England minister who agreed, the rector, and they felt that the only way to protect the towns around them was to remain within their own boundaries, prevent anyone from coming in, anyone from going out. They didn't know anything about the transmission of disease or contagion, but their leader believed that this is what God had told them to do. And with only a couple of exceptions, that's what they did for 14 long months. And many of them did die. But the amazing thing was that the plague remained the plague of London, and it didn't go past the boundary stones that they set up. They set up some stones outside of the town. They poured vinegar into some holes in the stones and left coins there, and people from neighbouring towns came to the stone and left food, and left for provisions for them, and took their pay. So this was an amazing thing. And of course, the very fact that this story has lived on for hundreds of years indicates the strength of Christian witness and Christian testimony in the worst of all times. In Psalm 91, it says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. And I will say to the Lord, you are my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." Now, there are many verses in Psalm 91 that we would like to grab hold of as absolute promises of protection. But I actually believe as Christians that we have to come to the point of standing before God and saying, my times are in your hands. My life is in your hands. And whatever you call us to do in this most difficult of times, we are still your servants and we are completely available to you. And where it says he who dwells, it's he who sits. And sitting is one of the things that we have actually been called to do this year. And I really believe that we are being given time that we might not have had otherwise to sit and to abide and to know the Lord in a whole new way. Bless you all.